stretching my normal from what I've read. I mean, I had the last one. So when in terms of stretching can be, so obviously since you're there, yeah. So at least you're there with them.
So I welcome those who are coming into the event for coming to the event. My name's Susie Hawkes. I'm going to wait just for a minute until to allow people to get into the event.
Yeah, I'm okay. I'm just there. I'm tired. I'm tired. I'm really tired. But it's not that I'm not working. And it's really tired. It's really tired. So at least I'm not working. I've been put to a meeting.
Right. Okay, I think we will get started. So welcome everyone to this event, which is an event by the University of Wolverhampton on social work with biracial children and adults. On the panel today, we have Dr. Remy Adekoya, who has, on the 3rd of February, published this book, which is, it is biracial, called Biracial Britain, a different way of looking at race. And Remy will talk to us a bit about his book and how he came to write it. We've got Natalie Sandar, who is a social worker at Derby City Council, and Natasha Ashman, who is a student who is doing her dissertation on children's biracial identities. So if people during the event, if people have questions, could you put your questions into the Q&A box, please, rather than into the chat? The chat can get pretty busy, and so it's difficult to identify all the questions. So they're much better if they can be put into the Q&A section. We won't be using the raised hand facilities. We don't have, we won't be taking questions direct. If you use the chat, you can use the chat facility, but if you could just be careful that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube after the event, and so just make sure that the information that you are putting into the events, putting into the chat is it is okay to be seen by everybody. So yes, I think that's it. I think we're now ready to start. So we will just start with a brief introduction to the event and why University of Wolverhampton decided to pull this event together. So since the death of George Floyd in May 2020 in Minneapolis in the US, there was a wave of protests swept all over the world from the US around racism and addressing issues of racism. There has been a significant response within the UK towards that event, and there's been a lot of discussion about race and racism and Black people's experiences of racism. What I had noticed is that the debate and the discussion which was taking place is often focused around the distinction between people who are Black and people who are white. As somebody who's mixed race myself, I was acutely aware that there was more to racial identity than just being either Black or white. And I think hopefully this event will explore those different issues. In previous webinars, we've also discussed around race, particularly around I'm not sure is, can I ask, is there something going on in the background? Sorry, everyone.
No, it's one of you guys. All participants, so all attendees, will not have their video or sound. So any background noise you can hear is coming from you guys there. So just don't worry, just carry on as normal.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, it's been raised in previous events, mainly over Black History Month, when we ran some events with the University of Durham and the University of West London. The issues around mixed race people's identities came up. And I had worked with Natalie in the past, and this is a conversation that we'd had in social work around how social work dealt with it, which is another reason why we wanted to have this conversation. And finally, from Remy's book, he quotes some statistics, which I think are really a really helpful place to start in terms of understanding the importance of this as an issue. And that is that mixed race people are the fastest growing ethnic minority in the United Kingdom, in Britain, and they will make up 30% of the population by the end of this century. And by 2150, they will make up 75% of the population. So I think this is an important, in terms of identity, understanding the complexities and the detail of how people identify who are mixed race or biracial, I think is important. So without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Remy Adekoya, who will introduce himself fully, and he will start off. Thank you.
Okay, unmuted now. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. So many people here. I looked, there's already 245 participants. That's a huge turnout. So thank you all very much. And I hope this will be useful and enjoyable for all of us. So a little bit about myself. I'm Remy Adekoya. I was born in Nigeria to a Nigerian father and Polish mother. I lived in Nigeria until I was 17. And so I went to primary and secondary schools in Nigeria. Now, as I wrote in the book, when you're mixed race, you're different, a little bit different or very different everywhere you are, but you're different in a different way depending on the dominant demographics of your environment. So Nigeria is a virtually all Black society. And so I was different in Nigeria for being light-skinned. And this shaped my whole sort of mixed race experience in Nigeria. Honestly speaking, while I did definitely know I was different, and this difference was communicated to me quite early in my life. So I'd be walking down the streets, for instance, with my mother, and kids might look at us and point and say the equivalent of, oh, white people. There's an Oyinbo, there's a Nigerian term for it in Nigerian Pidgin English, and they'd point at us and say, oh, Oyinbo, so white people. And so, the kids, yelling these things, it wasn't malicious. They were, we were exotic to them. So we were exotic to them for being light-skinned, and my mother was definitely exotic to them for being white. And so from that from my earliest years, there was always that sense of difference, of otherness. I can't remember a time where I didn't feel different from the environment around me. And so that was the general experience in Nigeria. Race is not really a big issue in Nigeria. People don't talk about it because of the fact that it's a very monoracial society. Like I said, it's probably 99.99% Black. There's perhaps, I don't know, 50,000, I think even less, people who are not Black who actually live in Nigeria. And so it's not an issue. Nobody talks about it. So in Nigeria, the identities which are important to people are ethnic identities. That's what people talk about. That's what affects the politics, and that's what affects the whole sort of public discourse. And so because of the fact that people around me didn't really talk about it, I think that in itself made me think about it less. I knew I was different. People sometimes pointed this out to me, sometimes in an unpleasant way, but mostly not. But I was reminded of this from time to time, but I didn't really think about race that much, and I didn't think of myself in racial terms because it simply wasn't an issue that functioned in Nigerian public debate. And so when I was 17, after finishing secondary school in Nigeria, I moved to Poland. So a virtually all-white society. So diametric difference of Nigeria, with the similarity being that, again, a monoracial society. And so in Nigeria, I stood out for being dark-skinned and was essentially seen as Black. So to the Polish eye, not used to seeing people of varying shades of brown and black. When they look at me, what they essentially see is a black person. And so this is how I was treated. Sometimes I'd talk to people and, and would mention that, oh, my mother is Polish. And sometimes people say, oh, wow. And then I'd get something which I often used to get in Nigeria. So in Poland, when I'd say, oh, my mother was Polish, people say, oh, wow, I'd never have said, or I'd never have told, sort of, or a clear sort of, oh, you don't look Polish. Whereas in Nigeria, very often, sometimes, if when people heard, my dad was Nigerian, they'd say, oh, you don't look Nigerian. And so in Poland, it was, sort of the other way around. And people say, oh, you don't look Polish. Oh, I wouldn't have said. And so I functioned in Nigeria essentially as a black person. And this was how people compartmentalized me. And importantly, this was how I began to think of myself. And I remember my mom visited me in Poland after I'd been there a couple of years. And after she'd been there a couple of days, she called me one day. She said, what's gotten into you that you used to think of yourself as an individual? Now, every first sentence, you start with, oh, we Black people this, we Black people that. How come you seem to be thinking of yourself simply in this kind of, racial group terms now? What's gotten into you? What's the problem? That I know how Polish people are, because I'm Polish myself. My mom was telling me, I know about the racism here, but you can't let these people, determine who you think you are and sort of force you, into this box in which you have now sort of, willingly accepted, and you just think of yourself, only in those kinds of, that kind of racial terms. And I thought about it, and it really struck me then. But of course, that doesn't mean I stopped thinking about myself primarily in those terms, because of course, my mother left, went back to Nigeria, and I was left there in Poland, a society which primarily viewed me through, oh, that's a Black guy lens, or that's someone from Africa lens. And so I did continue to think of myself in racial terms in Poland for a long time, until Poland joined the EU in the mid-2000s. And then, more foreigners started coming into the country, more Polish people started traveling to other countries, and there was more mixing, and people got more used to the idea of seeing Black and brown faces, at least in the capital city, Warsaw, and things sort of loosened up a bit, and it became an easier place to live in. And then I started to also think about myself less in strictly racial terms, and returned to thinking of myself as an individual, as Remy. And so that was Poland. Then I moved to the UK 6 years ago, and the UK is the first multiracial society I've ever lived in. So it's the first society I've ever lived in where there's a sizable population that is not white or not Black, And so if we talk about where, so undeniably, I see myself reflected more often here in Britain than I ever did living either in Nigeria or in Poland. Even though I live in Sheffield, I don't live in London, which is the most diverse city. Even though I live in a city like Sheffield, I still in Sheffield see myself in more people than I used to in both Nigeria and Poland. And so this has been a sort of welcome development, definitely for me. And so, okay, fine. So coming here to the UK, I came beginning of 2015. And so just as the Brexit referendum was taking off. And so, the Brexit, the referendum campaign started, and there was all these issues which everybody here, will know about, which went in, some, xenophobia, etc. In the Leave campaign, scaring people about, 80 million Turkish people are going to come to Britain if we don't leave the EU, because Turkey is just about to join the EU, and all those kinds of things. And race, race had always been discussed, obviously, in the UK, but during the Brexit campaign, it sort of returned to the fore pretty strongly, and there was, talk about, what's going on, and xenophobia and racism, etc. in Britain. And then November 2016, Trump won in the US, and that even further sort of intensified the whole debate around race and polarized it very strongly. Because, when an individual like that came to power saying the things he said, and people voted for him, it created, very strongly this kind of look. You can't be on the fence and say, oh, well, maybe these people are a little bit right, and maybe those people are a little bit right. You have to sort of declare, are you with us or are you with them? Are you with the Trump people? Or are you with those of us who are, trying to fight the Trump people and some of the things they're saying? And so, I started, feeling a little bit uncomfortable in that because of the fact of my mixed heritage. I've had both positive and negative experiences with my Black family, and I've had both positive and negative experiences with my white family. And so I know this sort of, we good, they bad division of the world, that's not reality. That's not how the real world functions. And so I started definitely, to feel uncomfortable with that there was the Meghan Markle marriage, I think 2018 it was. And again, talk started of, the biracialism. So, what is she? Is she biracial? Oh, she says she's biracial, but actually I think she's black. Oh, no, actually, I don't think she's really black, and all these kinds of people coming up with their opinions of, what is she or what should she be or what should she identify as? And that sort of also gave me the idea that, look, how exactly are mixed race people dealing with all these situations right now? Because if I am feeling, these kinds of contradictions in me, that I hear what one camp, let's call it, says, and I'm like, yeah, I agree with that. But then I hear perhaps something which someone from another camp says, and I say, well, that also seems to kind of make sense too. So, how are others dealing with this? And then I decided to write Biracial Britain. I was lucky to get publishers interested in it. And I said, what I don't want to write, because what I have noticed is that a lot of books on race are written here, in a top-down fashion, often by extremely clever people, extremely intelligent authors, usually, very prominent people, prominent journalists, etc. But it's a top-down narrative. It's the perspective of the author. Yeah, says, oh, I'm now writing a book on race in Britain. I'm going to tell you how race in Britain functions. And, people will, of course, cite all sorts of statistics to back up their argument. But at the end of the day, it's one person's perspective. So I wanted to get the perspectives of various people. And most importantly, I wanted to get the perspectives of, who we would, or who people described as regular people. So not people out there in the public eye, not people who have, this or that kind of public image to burnish, not people who are pursuing this or that kind of, grand ideological agenda, and those will tell you things, to suit that agenda, and definitely not tell you anything that might contradict that agenda. But, regular people, who simply, tell you how it is, who don't have anything invested, so to speak, in, how they might be perceived by the outside world. And this was very important for me. And I also wanted to speak to people not just focused in London. I also noticed that a lot of, the books written about race will tend to be written by people who live in London or some of the other bigger cities, and thus claim to talk about race in Britain, but de facto talk about race in London or some other bigger city. But Britain is a huge place, maybe not that huge, but definitely 66 million people and 10 million ethnic minorities. So there's 10 million stories out there, really. And so I wanted to speak to regular people. I wanted to speak to people of different generations. I knew, obviously, it must have been different. I mean, this I knew even before writing the book. It must have been different growing up mixed race in the 1950s and growing up mixed race in the 2000s. This I had no doubt about. So I wanted to get that perspective. And so that's why I also spoke to people of the older generation, people born during the Second World War, and talk about their experiences, because that was the first sort of sizable group of mixed race people, those born so-called brown babies. There have been books written about that specific group. So I spoke to people from that generation, then spoke to people in their 50s, people in their 40s, people in their 30s, people in their 20s. So the oldest person I spoke to was 73, the youngest was 6. A 6-year-old girl, of course, I conducted that interview. I mean, we can call it, her mother essentially conducted the interview for me. I gave her the questions to ask, and we're all in the room together, and I simply listened to the answers and noted them down. And so I wanted to get those different perspectives also. What did I find out? A third thing which was really important to me is that I do know that when people think of biracial or mixed race, the focus tends to be on people of my kind of racial mix, so the black-white mix, because so much of the debate around race is essentially around the relationship between black and white. And so the other minority groups here in Britain, there tends to be much less about, so what is the white English-Indian relationship like? What is the Pakistani English relationship like? It's very much focused around black-white. And so I wanted to speak to people of racial mixes, not black or white. So 50% of the mixed race people in the UK are mixed black-white, but the other 50% are of a different racial configuration. The second largest group is people who are classified as mixed Asian white. And then the third group is people who are classified as mixed other, so no white parent. And so I spoke to people from these various groups, and some common themes emerge. So irrespective of whether people are of mixed black-white heritage or mixed Indian-white heritage or mixed Pakistani-Lebanese heritage, a couple of common themes emerged. One, that definite sense of otherness, of difference in whichever group they happen to be in at any given time. So always that sense of, well, I'm a little bit different and people see me as a little bit different. This doesn't always manifest itself negatively, but the feeling is there in the people I spoke to. Second common theme and a source of serious frustration for a lot of people is that sense of society not asking us who we are, but telling us who we are. So like I said, I might meet somebody and they say, oh, what's your name? Oh, yeah, Remy. Ah, okay. So, where are you from? And I might just start out by mentioning Nigeria and say, Nigeria? Ah, you don't look like a Nigerian to me, and things like that. Or people will say, oh, well, actually, I see you as a Nigerian. Or somebody will say, oh, no, I don't see you as a Nigerian. I see you as this or that. And so people constantly telling mixed race people who they are rather than asking them who they are. And this is a constant source of frustration because it gives you, it's a sense of powerlessness. Okay, that I don't have the power to sort of determine how I'm perceived by the rest of the world, even with something as basic as my racial or ethnic identity, which of course, if you're 100% Black, there's disadvantages that definitely come with that, but nobody's ever going to question that, and that is a done fact. Someone who has Kenyan parents is, Kenyan in Kenya, Kenyan in Scotland, and Kenyan in Brazil, and nobody's going to dispute that. But when you're mixed race, then you're somebody else in Kenya, somebody else in Brazil, and somebody else in Scotland. So this was something which tended to frustrate people. Another thing, just final point, I'll make definitely, is one thing I really saw is that how important love, and especially and most beautifully unconditional love, can help make that mixed race experience better for the adult when they experience that as a child. And it was so clear, even when I spoke to some people whose parents had had a very difficult time because of the fact that they married outside their race, quote unquote, even though the parents had had a very difficult time, those who said, but in the end, in our home, my parents loved each other. I felt a lot of love from my parents. And even though, the communities around us didn't sort of see us as one of them, didn't give us that sense of belonging, because of the fact that I felt so loved at home, I generally felt safe. And I did notice that these people as adults, as far as you can take what's on the surface from adults, but my read of them was that people who'd had that love, in childhood did seem to be, much happier as adults when I spoke to them, and did seem to be sort of dealing with the whole mixed race experience much more easily than those who you could sense, either they said explicitly or you could sense implicitly that love perhaps was not really there at a young age when they were children. And they often would tend to be, a bit more insecure, a bit more sort of anxious about their place in the world, and generally have a more difficult time of navigating that mixed race experience. So these were just some of the core themes, which I noticed. So, I'd be happy to, I don't want to talk for too long, so I'd be happy to, others on the panel to speak, and then for us to be able to start taking questions. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Remy. That's really interesting. And I think there's loads of stories in your book, which it's really insightful, actually, reading the enormous differences and picking out those themes that people have in terms of the issues that people have raised through their different experiences of being mixed race all around the world, which I think is, like you say, is really important. So thank you. Moving on, Natalie, do you want to go next? I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself in more detail and to kick off. Thank you.
Hi, so my name's Natalie. I'm a social worker currently in the duty and assessment team in Derby. So what I'm going to talk a little bit is about my own personal experience. I'm from a mixed race family, dual heritage I am. My father is Indian, an Indian Sikh. My mum is Ukrainian Catholic. I have two siblings. So my two siblings are their skins are brown. They've got dark features, where I had blonde hair as a child with very green eyes. So from early childhood, I felt that I was very different to my siblings. However, I live in an area of Derby which is very diverse, very multicultural, and I went to a school and I had friends who were also of dual heritage, and it became normal to me that that my friends, their parents, a lot of parents, their mums were white and their dads were Black Caribbean. So I felt that I was okay, it was normal. And it wasn't until I went to secondary school that I started to question my own ethnicity, like my own heritage. So it began with people questioning me. So it was about my surname. They would ask me why my surname was Sandor, where it originated from. And I then started asking questions to my own family, to my paternal side of the family. And my dad was like, oh, that isn't our real surname. Our real surname is Sandu, but it was changed for Sandor because a long time ago, my grandfather most probably had more than one wife. So it was really difficult. So then I felt like, well, where am I? Who am I? Who am I then? If this isn't a real name, who am I? So I asked more questions, but my dad really didn't want to answer these questions. My grandmother really didn't want to answer these questions. And at the time, and still now, my grandfather wasn't around and he couldn't answer these questions. So whilst in my teen years at school, I went to a school which predominantly was 75%, I would say, British-born Pakistani children. And it was a very diverse school. So I then they were questioning me whether, who am I? Am I Asian? Am I white? Because from appearance, you look at me, I look very white British. I had blonde hair then, very white British. And I then started to question myself, who am I? Who do I belong with? And my parents couldn't give me those answers. So then I started to ask more at school and I started to ask staff about it. And there was one member of staff within the school who was really like, right, I'll help you, Natalie, I'll help you more look into this. And at the time, I didn't know very much about my Ukrainian heritage because my mum, and when they began their relationship, she was kind of disowned from that community because mixed relationships wasn't accepted. So I still had lots of questions around my ethnicity, my heritage, the culture of the Ukrainian, my Ukrainian side as well. So, and my mum couldn't answer those questions, and it was something which she most really didn't want to because she had experienced racism herself being in a relationship with my dad. So at school, I challenged a lot, and there was celebrations at school for different religions, and I always wanted to be invited to these celebrations, and I was told no. Time that I really challenged it, and I went to the governors and I wanted to join. Sorry, has it gone off? I'm still here. Yeah, I wanted to join a celebration. It was Diwali. I really wanted to be a part of this celebration at school, and they said I couldn't, and I couldn't go to the class at dinner time to help prepare for this celebration. And they thought I was being racist. Sorry. Oh, they thought I was being racist. And it wasn't until they met my dad. They said, oh, you can come now. We didn't know that your dad was Asian. So you can be a part of that. And I was trying to explain, well, you shouldn't have made that, like taken that view on my appearance, only because you've met my dad now that you've allowed me to be part of this celebration. And I really was trying to get them across that I'm dual heritage, and there was a lot of other young people within the school that were dual heritage, but still wasn't being accepted, and also it wasn't being spoken about as much. I then went on to college, and that was where I really, really struggled at college because I got told that I needed to either join one side. So I needed either to identify as being Asian, or I needed to identify as being dual heritage and being with friends of the Black Caribbean community and with other white friends who were part of that. And I found that really difficult because these were my friends who I'd grown up with all my life, and they were still asking me to choose because I had lots of friends who were from the Asian community as well. And again, I was questioning my ethnicity, what's best here, where do I go, where do I fit in? And that was it, where do I fit in and who's going to accept me? Because you're looking at me, I'm very white British. And at that time, I was still identifying, when you're filling in forms as white British. So I was still, on paperwork, I was still saying I was white British as well. And then it wasn't until I became pregnant with my own daughter that I really looked into it all. And I I went to the library, I went to the study library, found my grandparents' marriage certificates. I found so much, and I found her original name, where we'd come from. I then got in contact with the Ukrainian community, and I started to build on this, and I started to do this for my own daughter, because my own daughter is of mixed race. She's dual heritage. So my father's Indian, well, I'm dual heritage, so she's Indian, she's Ukrainian, and also her dad is Black Caribbean, so her family's from Jamaica. And it was something which I really wanted for her. I wanted her to feel that she knew enough about her heritage and her ethnicity. And from her being a young age, I then made contact with the different services in Derby, which was brilliant. It was really good. We had links with the West Indian community in Derby, the Ukrainian community in Derby, and I'd already formed those relationships with friends and within the Sikh community. And that was something which I really wanted to promote with my own daughter's identity as well as my own, because I was learning about myself as well as with her. So that carried on, and we celebrated like Black History Month, but we did it throughout the year. And we went to different celebrations, and our whole family, even my mum and dad, became a part of it, which was lovely. It was really good for us. But people would still not see me as anything other than white British. So I would talk and they'd say, "How do you know so much?" And I'd say, "Because this is my heritage. This is my heritage. I can tell you about this." Well, how? Because you're white. Well, no, I'm not. And I'd have to go through with people. And I started to get to the point of thinking, why do I need to keep explaining to you why I feel like this and what I know? Because on appearance, you've taken me again as very white British. So I carried on, and we carried on and we promoted it with my daughter. And at primary school, everything was okay, but again it changed for her when she went to secondary school, and she had to find where she fit in at school, and with friendship groups, where did it fit in for her? And I really didn't want her to go through the same things of what I had felt. And it was something which I spoke about her with, her grandparents spoke to her about. And I mean, at that time she was, like I said, she was having involvement in the West Indian community. She was learning about the history of the Ukraine, and we were really promoting it, but she still struggled throughout school. Now, that, me, myself, and everything I've gone through, as well as my daughter, really, really made me think about what work I wanted to do in the future, and working with children and families of different ethnicities, especially dual heritage children as well. I began working in a school in Derby, which was a predominantly very Asian school, but there was some children of dual heritage in there, and I could really understand with how their views on their ethnicity and how they felt within the school. And I started working with parents at the school at the time about engaging in services and everything. It was really positive. And then I decided to go into social work, and so I went into social work, and it's something Susie was one of the managers within the team, and it was something we would talk about quite a lot, about working with families of dual heritage families. And when I began working, I was working in a very white British area of Derby, where and there were some families, dual heritage families within those areas. And I was thinking, how can I work best with these families? What are we going to do? So from there, my social work practice is underpinned by my own experience of being someone who is dual heritage, who is mixed race. And within my assessments, and especially within my long-term work, it was really something which I practiced. I always made sure that I could do that one-to-one work with the parents to get their story. Let me listen to your story. Let me find out about what your story is. Marriage, relationships, how that's worked for them within the community, the religion, and then also the cultural norms and the barriers what are in place. And then for me, my main focus was about the child. Let's talk about the child, their identity. What do they see themselves as? And I always would let the child tell me first, when they could, how they identified themselves. And we'd go through that, the identity and the belonging, and where do you see yourself now within the community, with friends, peers, and talking about the religion as well. And it was just something which sometimes we feel a bit too scared to ask that question. Sometimes, do we want to ask that question about race? Do we want to talk openly about it? And it's something which I've really promoted within my families of dual heritage and also white British families as well. Let's talk about it. Don't feel frightened to ask those questions, because those questions are sometimes led to people feeling isolated, feeling not belonging, feeling isolated within communities. And they're the barriers what put us in place in order for us to complete our job sometimes as social workers. I mean, now I'm in a duty and assessment team, so it's a very quick pace and we only hold the cases for a short period of time. But when I was in long-term work, that became very much focused on some of my work where children's identity was one of the factors within my assessment what needed addressing. And for me, it was working with the services which really supported me within my job role, and working with parents, doing the one-to-one work with them, helping them to understand like even self-care of another child and the caring of them, and like promoting like Black British male role models or any role models of different ethnicities, and talking to families about it. It was just something which I felt really passionate about and still do now. And myself and Susie speak quite a lot about this, and it's something which I spoke about with my daughter when Susie asked me about this, and she said to me afterwards, "Mama, are you really going to speak about this?" And I said, "Yeah, we are." And she said, "You can't." And I was like, "Why?" She went, "Because nobody really talks about it." And I said, "What do you mean no one really talks about it?" She said, "Nobody really talks about people who are mixed race or dual heritage." She said, and she was like, "It's not." She says, "What about if people see it wrong in what you're saying?" And I started talking about Remy then. I'd had a quick look at some of Remy's work and I was explaining that to her, and I was talking about Susie. And she said to me, "I feel that's really empowering that now we can start talking about this," because she felt that sometimes that I am and she is sometimes not spoken about. It is either white or Black. And she said, "Where do I fit in? Where do we fit in?" And she said it's something which, like she said, now it's growing. There is going to be more people of dual heritage and different ethnicities, and it's just good that we can talk about that and also break down those barriers, and especially for us within social work practice. That's it. Is that okay? Thank you, everyone.
That was great. Thank you, Natalie. As Natalie says, we have had a lot of these conversations over a number of years. And looking at the chat, actually, Natalie, as you were talking, there was lots of people who were saying that they had had similar experiences. And Tariq had said that he got the same from school, that you don't look like your surname. And I think that these are really important things to talk about, because I think these are the things that are often unique to people who have got these mixed identities and mixed racial identities. So thank you very much. Last but not least, Natasha, who's on our MA course, our MA social work course here, and currently on placement at Wolverhampton City Council. So I will hand over to you to introduce yourself more fully and say your piece. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Susie. Yeah, I'm Natasha Ashman. I'm currently an MA student at the University of Wolverhampton, as Susie said, doing social work. I did want to say thank you to Susie for sharing the platform and allowing me to be part of the event today, and I have found it really insightful for my practice being a student so far. And also thank you to my practice supervisor, Kelly Hines, within the Power 2 team. And a big thank you to Fiona Morgan, who's my dissertation supervisor. So she's been really, really helpful with the ongoing support so far. I'll just give a brief rundown of my dissertation and its purposes, really. Okay, so my dissertation topic is with regards to mixed identity. And my research question is, how does being of mixed heritage, which is Black, Caribbean and or African, because there are many differences which are sometimes unknown within those two heritages, and how does this affect an individual's identity, really? The main interest in the topic came about due to my own experiences being mixed growing up. My mum was born in Jamaica and my father is white British. So it was a very different experience for me due to the fact that my mum was actually born in Jamaica, and having that type of cultural difference, and then being brought up over here. She came over at quite a young age. So that was my own personal experiences growing up. And then my other experiences within the education sector, and more recently in the social work sector. And I'm kind of growing to find that it is still very much an underrepresented and sort of misunderstood area, and a little bit of a taboo topic almost within the UK, I tend to find. So as I kind of mentioned, I still am very much within the research process stage of my dissertation and with my findings. However, my dissertation it's based on the analysis of 4 autobiography authors. So that has included Akala, Afua Hirsch, David Olusoga, and Kelly Holmes, just to sort of gather the differences and the cultural aspects, because I wanted to find 2 authors that had a Jamaican background, and then 2 authors that had an African background, just to see if I could find any how those cultural differences affect that mix and those experiences for those mixed individuals. So Dr. Remy has actually sort of confirmed a lot of my findings, actually, which was quite interesting. So far I'm tending to find that the common discourse really with regards to the main identity issues faced by many mixed race children or individuals is due to the juxtaposed position that we face, really, and that's due to the 2 in a black and white context, predominantly how I'm doing Jamaican and African mix. The issues stem due to the sort of the significant differences from both cultures and heritages, and what those histories are as well, and the significance of that. And then just to add, it's obviously socially constructed as opposed to biologically constructed, as history has sort of gone along. That shift has sort of changed in those ideologies. Another significant factor which Dr. Remy also mentioned and alluded to was it's just the importance of secure and positive parenting, just highlighting the importance of that, and parents that are secure in their identity, whether they're black or white themselves, in bringing up mixed race children. Findings have sort of found that has been found to create a more secure mixed race experience almost, and parents or caregivers that were sort of realistic about racism and supporting of that with their children. And lastly, really to conclude, the main purpose of my research was just really to create a better environment for people of mixed heritage, and that's in terms of all sectors really, so health, education, and social work, as that's the field and sector that I'll be sort of working within, and just to create a teaching and learning opportunity really for parents and professionals in particular, just to, as Natalie suggested as well, just to enhance practice, especially within the social work sector. As sort of mentioned before, I still feel that this area is quite often overlooked as a significant factor of identity and social issues, and what those links are. So quite often remedying those issues often kind of help to remedy other issues, but quite often these issues are not seen as significant issues almost. So that was my main issues for my research to take into to create better practice, really. And yeah, I'm just happy to be a part of the change within social work.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Natasha. That is brilliant. And I think that some of the things that you said, having read Remy's book, I think you were raising some of the issues that your research is finding, some of the issues that I think are drawn out in Remy's, in the work that Remy did in his book. And I think it's I mean, one of the huge themes that I think's just run through all of those talks is that idea of who decides, who decides on your identity. And I think that's clearly seems to be, to me, such a big issue, and it's a big thing in your book, Remy, and stuff. So I think that's an important thing as social workers we need to hold on to, that we do talk a lot about identity, and I think there's quite a lot of pressure at the moment against the background of that sort of the George Floyd and the what's come out of that, for us to have preconceived ideas about what people's identity is, when actually there is such a broad range of different identities out there. So we have tons of questions. So I'm going to try, we won't get through them all because we already have too many, I think, to get through in the hour and a quarter we have left. But I think a key question that I think is probably worth giving to everyone, actually, which is something that did come up when I was advertising the event and has come up in some of the questions, and that is the issue of terminology. So we have had a question from Lorraine, who has said, hello, I'm interested in your choice of terminology. Can you explain why you chose biracial? And then we've had one from Natalie as well, who said, can I ask if we use the term mixed race? As I was informed, we should use the term dual heritage in social work. Is biracial used more in the US? So I think just to sort of unpack those issues of terminology, again, I think this is a big question, and I think it's particular to social work. I think social work gets itself caught up with language, and so I think it'd be interesting to have a conversation about what you think about actually the issues around terminology when talking about people who are mixed race, biracial, dual heritage. And there are other terms that some people would find particularly offensive, but I know that I was called growing up, such as half caste and those sorts of terms. And these terms are still in active use for some people. So given that your book is called Biracial Britain, Remy, do you want to talk a little bit to start with about why you chose to call it Biracial Britain rather than perhaps mixed race Britain or, yeah, dual heritage Britain?
So to be as I love this environment here, because I can see, you know, we're all frank and everybody, you know, is speaking their mind, etc. So to be perfectly frank with you, I chose that title because I thought it had a better ring to it than mixed race Britain. This is the truth, okay? And I know it's a terminology which is increasingly being used, biracial. So famously, Meghan Markle, like I say here in Britain, really, I think popularized the term because that's how she described herself. It is something which started earlier on in the US and then, you know, has been used here. And I definitely know it's not a term which offends anyone or which people find, you know, which people find offensive. Obviously, I wouldn't have used a term which people find offensive just because it has a good ring to it. So that's the main reason, you know, mixed race Britain, I don't think would have been as would have had the kind of ring to it that Biracial Britain does. So that's it. There was no sort of really sophisticated thought process behind that that particular choice. So that's the real honest answer to this. Dual heritage. I did definitely notice that when I spoke to people, a lot of people seem increasingly to like that term. You know, I'm someone of dual heritage. You know, so I find this is definitely a term which people like to use. But then, of course, there's people of multiple heritages. You know, so that's something completely different. But that's the honest answer to your question.
That's great, and we do like an honest answer. So yeah, it's Natalie. Do you want to respond next?
Yeah. So biracial isn't a word which I do use or I have used. So like the wordings do change, don't they, over the years in regards to talking to people of dual heritage, but now it is dual heritage, and we still sometimes use the word mixed ethnicity or mixed race, and I know people do use that still. So I use the word dual heritage when I can, or of mixed ethnicity. But as Remy said, there is people of dual heritage, as like I said, my daughter of dual multi-heritage. Okay. So yeah, so it's very difficult, and I think sometimes people are a bit afraid of what word to use as well, because they don't want to offend other people. So I think it's being politically correct as well, but being able to use the right word. And I think people are always a bit like, is that the right word to use to describe or not? So it's a bit difficult sometimes.
No, I agree. It's not. It's my personal thing is that I don't particularly get too caught up in what people choose to call. I think if you want to call yourself mixed race, you call yourself mixed race. Yeah. And if you want to call yourself biracial, you call yourself biracial. It's part of your identity, isn't it? Being able to decide what you call yourself.
Totally, but I also think, Susie, people still do use the wrong word sometimes, as you've like said, being called off caste. And my daughter's been called it a number of times, so were we as children. And it's about educating people as well. And that's something which I still find myself doing now at work, as well as not being at work. Is about talking to people about using, about what happened to my blonde hair. Coloured, it's been changed, but yeah, so it's about talking to people and about using the right words. And I still do that with some of the like older generation within the people, and talking to them, say, well, no, we don't use that word no more, and being open and talking about it. And just also, because when some children, I know we've had this discussion, Susie, some children are born into families where racism is still an issue, it's still a factor. And how other family members relate to that child's ethnicity can still be, it's racist. And it's also, if we do have a family like that within our social work, it's working with the family, not just with the mum and the child, but also with the extended family members as well. And I think that's something really important for us, what we need to do.
Yeah, no, I agree. Natasha, what are your thoughts on terminology?
Hi. Yeah, just to sort of second what's been said, really. I do think, and again, doing my research, I do think that terminology is still very much an issue and a taboo subject area as well. And I do think it's one of those things that will probably be an ongoing kind of process almost. So like we said, in history, not so long ago, the term half caste was used, and that was appropriate for that era and that time. And then now to current day, when we sort of more lean towards mixed heritage or dual heritage, I tend to sort of second what Natalie said, and more dual heritage and mixed heritage. Although me, myself personally, I tend to, with my own personal experiences growing up, predominantly with my mum, who was my significant parent, who was Black and in a Rastafarian culture as well. So I tend to identify more in a Black context, which I know is confusing for some people. But yeah, I tend to say mixed heritage or mixed heritage. But yeah, I do think it's one of those things that will be, it will just sort of shift with the ages, what is appropriate at the time and what's not deemed appropriate at the time. And research has sort of suggested, that I've looked at so far, I think the issue is the fact that when the word mixed is used, it's sort of suggesting that you're not a whole person. So that is where the offence comes in for some people, to suggest that you're mixed and you're not kind of valued as a whole person. You're part of a person, part of two people. So yeah, that's pretty much my thoughts so far.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. No, that's interesting. And I think it does, again, it just speaks to the great diversity in how different people of mixed identities do identify themselves. Yeah, no, that's great. So moving on to the next question, which Natasha, you might want to have a go at to start with, actually, is that this is I think it's probably aimed at Remy, who we'll come to later, but it's a question about, you were saying about different experiences of whether it's your mother or father that's black and white, and does that change how people's experiences of being biracial? What have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely feel, well, from a personal standpoint with my own experiences, and just I've always been interested in this topic and subject area anyway, due to my own personal experiences. However, in doing my research for my dissertation, I've done a lot of speaking to a lot of my friends and family and just people in general, really. About the topic. So the sense that does tend to be like a general consensus about that issue. And I do definitely feel that can be a factor, because I predominantly, and research suggests that the mix for being, well, I know there's lots of mixes like we talk about, but in terms of a black and white mix, in that context, it usually is a white mother and a black father, usually. So I am one of the minority that has it the other way around, where my mom's the black person in the relationship or in the union, and my dad's the white person. So I definitely feel, and the fact that again, it really shifts and differs, and so many factors are involved, because maybe if I lived together with them in a household, that might have shaped and sort of changed the experience I had. But because I didn't, and I lived in my mom's household predominantly with her as the significant parent, who, as I said, was born in Jamaica, black person, and then also the added sort of religious context, because she's in a Rasta kind of culture. It was, yeah, that definitely shaped me, and I feel like it was significant. So I was taught to
Oh, Natasha's frozen. Do you want to pick up, Remy?
Yeah, I think it's a hugely interesting question. And I think, like almost everything else with a mixed race experience, it's extremely contextual. Extremely contextual. So Natasha said something very important. She said her mom, who was from Jamaica, was the significant parent. Now, I spoke to, I remember as she was speaking, I remembered a girl I spoke to, or a lady I spoke to for the book, whose mom was Ugandan and dad was white English. But her mom was the significant parent. Her mom essentially brought her up. The dad played a very little role, a very small role in bringing her up, essentially no role. And she said she got mad because when she'd visit Uganda with her mom, because of the fact that Uganda happens to be a very strongly patriarchal society, there she was denied Ugandanness, denied blackness, with the argument that, but your dad is a white man, so we can't see you as a Ugandan, because there the idea is that you are what your father is, you see. So because of the fact that and generally the reality of it is that many African societies do still tend to be strongly patriarchal. So because I had a Nigerian father, so when you hear my surname in Nigeria, you know, aha, his father is Nigerian. Because I had a Nigerian father, I was never explicitly denied Nigerianness. You know, no one ever told me that, oh, you know, really, Remy, we can't really buy you as a Nigerian. Obviously, the fact I was born there and went to school there also helped. But this was very important, the fact my father was Nigerian. So, aha, I was seen as having a legitimate claim to Nigerianness. So this lady I told you about was seen as not having a legitimate claim to Ugandanness because of the fact that her father was white and it was her mother that was black. So you can, so that's different. Now, of course, here in the UK, the patriarchy is definitely not as strong, let me put it that way. And so probably there's less of a likelihood, I would hope, and I would assume, and I think this also came out from the people I spoke to, that you'd be denied a certain identity because it's just your mom who's from there, not your father. But again, another interesting story I also had from a different culture, but similar with the patriarchy angle. I remember a lady I spoke to, Pakistani Lebanese, whose dad was Pakistani, mom Lebanese. And she says, look, for Lebanese people, I essentially have no claim to Lebanese-ness because my father is not Lebanese. That generally Lebanese people only acknowledge people who both parents are Lebanese as Lebanese. And definitely, if she said she can't even get a Lebanese passport because of the fact that her father is not Lebanese, you know, it's her mother who is Lebanese. So that doesn't entitle her to a Lebanese passport. So you see here how, you know, patriarchy, the level of patriarchy in a society can determine actually which identity you are seen as having a legitimate claim to.
That's really interesting, I think, for social work particularly, because I think it means for social workers understanding that people's identity may actually be significantly affected by the culture of another country. That you can't simply think about that people's identity may be forged within the UK if you're doing an assessment on an elderly person for a place in an old people's home, or for someone who needs a care package, or a child. That actually that you need to be thinking more broadly about how their culture impacts upon how racial identity might be constructed, that it may be being constructed outside of the UK in part. And I think that's something perhaps that we don't think of when we're working with people, and that when we're doing assessments of people and making decisions about what we think their identities are. Natalie, do you want to? You're okay.
Yeah, no, I'm okay. I've got no more to say on that.
No, that's great. Okay, so moving on. I think we've possibly lost Natasha. Hopefully she'll come back at some point. So this is an interesting question, is that from Bernard, says that DNA tests are gradually showing that we all have sort of African links, which I think is probably true from a sort of biological developmental sort of way. And I think perhaps as thinking about the way that we are in a much more global society, and that people are definitely moving away, is why do members of the panel think that people in all societies continue to view skin colour so negatively? Which I think is interesting in the context of globalization, the fact that we are such a, we see people, we just live with people who are very, very different to us on our TVs, on our cinema screens. And yeah, so what are people's thoughts on that? Do you want to start, Remy? I think that's something perhaps you is probably in your area of politics as well around that.
So the question would be, if you wouldn't just mind repeating the specific question, it would be whether, if you wouldn't mind repeating the specific question.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Yeah, it was saying that basically, do members of the panel think in all society, why do members of the panel think all people in all societies continue to view skin colour so negatively?
I definitely wouldn't say all people in all societies continue to view skin color so negatively. Like I say, usually very often in monoracial societies, race is not even an issue of public debate, because if 99% of the people are black or white or brown skinned, then it's not even a factor of debate. So race is only really debated in countries which have a significant racial minority or racial minorities. So that's why it's a big deal here in the UK, it's a big deal in the US, and it's a big deal in other such countries. So this is strongly dependent on that. I would say one of the biggest problems we have with race is actually not the fact of race itself as a social construct, because people say, oh, race is a social construct. Yes, it is. But the question is actually, why does it matter? It wouldn't matter at all to anybody's life if race existed as a social construct. But say, for instance, the overwhelming majority of white people had overwhelmingly positive opinions about Black people and vice versa. Then it really race wouldn't mean anything in anybody's life, in everybody's everyday life. The only reason it means something and it's a problem is that because we associate negative assumptions with people based on that skin color, based on their racial category. That is why it's a problem, really. So the problem is really these negative assumptions, because if all the assumptions were positive, then no problem. We'd all be happy, holding each other's hands and, and wandering off to the sunlight, every day. So it's the negative assumptions that the problems come from. So now the question is, okay, why do these negative assumptions exist? First of all, why do people make those assumptions? Well, people make those assumptions, and cognitive scientists have shown this in research, because every day we make hundreds, sometimes thousands of little decisions in our everyday lives. The human brain really doesn't have the time to process that whole decision-making process, and think about the pros and the cons, and why do I think this, why don't I think this? So we make a lot of snap decisions. We just see somebody or we see something and there's an association in our head: good, bad, danger, threat, something to go near, something to stay away from. That's the way the human brain functions. So now we come into, okay, why have there been so many negative assumptions associated with particular groups, with particular racial groups, and then we go into history, we go into people's, historical memory, what people remember, what were people taught, what were people told about these kind of people, So the question really is, what do people think being a Black person says about you? What do people think being a white person says about you? What do people think being an Indian says about you? These are where the problems start to come in, And so then we have to attack, okay, why do people think being a Black person automatically says this about you? Where does this come from? How does that process work? And how do we go on improving that? Because like I said, where we want to be is a place where we all generally have a generally positive view of other racial groups. That's where we want to be,
Yeah. No, yes, absolutely. Natalie, did you want to come in on that? No.
No, I think Remy covered it all, but I think one thing for me is around like media. I think social media, it's got a lot to answer for in regards to people's opinions of people who have dual heritage, Black or white. And I think social media, the news, what we see every day, that will form our opinions. And I think that was just something which we spoke about earlier before we started this, was how it does impact on how sometimes how people will work with families, or their opinions of what they've seen on TV, and like we said, where we are today and what's happening in the world in regards to racism and in different countries. And I just think social media has so much to answer for in regards to people's opinions of people of different races, ethnicities.
Oh, thank you, Natalie. So this is a long question, but I think it goes back to this idea that the question around what terminology people should use. And I think it's interesting for in social work terms, and particularly for social workers who are working with older people who perhaps do use different terminology. But I think that you will probably, it's fair to say that you also have it from people who come from different parts of the world who may have different dominant terminologies. So basically the question's quite a long one, but essentially the question is asking, is it okay for people in social work who want to identify themselves as half caste, do you know what I mean, or mixed race or biracial, dual heritage, brown coloured? Is it, even if the other person isn't comfortable with it? So if social work isn't comfortable with it, is it okay for us as social workers to use these terminologies? Which I think is an interesting question. If other people aren't in hell. Do you want to start, Natalie?
I think we've had this conversation before, Susie. So again, it goes back to not just educating, but talking to families, talking to people about it, talking about the different words, what can be used to describe someone's ethnicity, even religion as well. I think, I mean, from experience, I have had somebody who identified using half caste, and that was because their parent had used that terminology to identify the child. So it was that one-to-one work, working with the family, talking about how that has been used negatively. That word has been used negatively as well, and how that might make people feel. And I always remember as a child, my dad brought me up with this poem about what does coloured mean, because people were referred to as coloured before. And it went through like all these different, when you're white, if you feel poorly, then you feel like this, or if you get sunburnt, you'll be red. And it was explained to me what people refer to people what weren't white as coloured. And that through one-to-one work with parents and working with families and children about, yes, that might be the word what they identify with, like we said, being half caste, but okay, what about this? And talking about it and making families feel comfortable to talk about it as well. And it's really difficult when you're working with somebody who that is all they know, and that's how they will refer to themselves. And that's through one-to-one work, which I've done. It's around promoting positive. It's about promoting positive, like we said, role models, about positive language. And because what they may use within the home may be very different outside that, and the impact what that can have on that child or family, not just now, but also in their future, and how they identify themselves as well. So what I do is I always ask the family I always ask the family and let them tell me their ethnicity, let them identify themselves to me. I want to know what their identity is. I let them tell me what their ethnicity is, what their religion. I don't make an assumption and say, all right, okay, are you Black Caribbean or are you Catholic? I let them tell me first, and then I will work on from that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key things for social work, isn't it? It's that engaging with people and talking to them about understanding why they use the terminologies as well, because I think there are a whole range of reasons why people use terminologies based upon things like how old they are, what they were brought up with, what their parents used, and what is used in their countries of origin, in terms of, particularly if they've got strong links to their countries, to sort of other countries.
I think it's also about understanding as well, if you go into a household which isn't white British and living in the UK, what has that life been like for that family? What have they experienced? What have they experienced from even the parents to grandparents to the child? And it's knowing that, getting that story, getting the family story, letting them talk to you first, and also reflecting on yourself. I mean, I go into the houses, nobody knows that I'm dual heritage. Sometimes I think people might ask questions about my surname, but I always put myself in that position as a family. What about if I went a very strict family, an Islamic family, Pakistani family, and then I go in and I'm saying, this is what we're expecting, this is what we need. You can't do that. We need to get a good understanding of the family, the story, the identity, the ethnicity, what the family have been through also, and why we are where we are today. And I think that's really important about listening to those families we work with, or even as in adults. I've did some placements with adults, listening to the older generation, listening to their story and what's happened and the reason why they might use that terminology. And I just think it's so important.
No,
I think have I answered it? Sorry, Susie.
Yes, no, that's fine. No, that's great. No, thank you, Natalie. Remy, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
I think Natalie said it all. One really has to study the society you are in, and again, context is everything. So there was a part in the book which I wrote, which I know for some people might be controversial. So in Nigeria, generally, up till today, and definitely this was the case when I was growing up, the term for people like me was was caste in Nigeria. Now, this term is a neutral term in Nigerian lingo within Nigerian society. It has no negative connotations whatsoever. It is simply the way people describe people like me. They say, oh, look at that guy. Oh, he's a half caste. Oh, look at that guy. Oh, you're my half caste friend. It is a completely neutral term. My mother tried to get me to be outraged at people calling me a half caste. And it was my mother who sat me down and told me that, look, this is bad. It comes from the Indian caste system. It has horrible historical connotations, etc., etc. I write about it in the book. I said, but Mom, the people calling me a half caste here, they're not saying it maliciously. It's a neutral term here. So why should I be offended? My mom said, no, you should be offended because of the historical context. I said, but Mom, the people who are calling me, who say half caste here, they have no idea about this Indian caste system and all these historical contexts you're telling me about. They don't know all this stuff, So it doesn't mean anything here. So you see meaning, context, because of the fact that when people called me that, they didn't call it with any sort of negative intent. It wasn't said to diminish me. You see, when people use a word at you, when people call you a thing, and you sense that this is said to diminish me, then of course you will react negatively to that, and you will react badly to that, and your ego will rightly want to defend you from that. But when people call you a term and you sense, especially everybody around that, they are saying it completely neutrally, it might not have that effect. So the honest truth is that when I was growing up in Nigeria, half-caste, it was used like that, and it never had a negative effect on me because nobody ever said it to diminish me. And this was clear to me, Of course, British society has a different history. It's a different context there. And also, you know the society you are in, and you have to study it. So every society, there's a certain consensus emerges on, what can be said, what can't be said, why this can't be said, etc. So obviously in British society, the context is very different. But I can easily imagine someone coming from Nigeria who you might be working with, who perhaps grew up in Nigeria, a Nigerian parent, for instance. I can easily imagine them describing their child as a half-caste, but not thinking there's anything wrong with that. Yeah. I can imagine that, and of course, like you say, it might be your role to explain that, well, here in the UK, it's different, the context is different. This means something different. It has been used to diminish people in the past. Okay. And so this is why it is not okay to use that term here in the UK, So it's all about that. It's all about knowing the society you are in and the historical context of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that difference between how terms are used across different cultures and different communities is really important. And I think perhaps makes social work a particular challenge in the UK, where we do have, it is, like you said right at the beginning, that it is a multiracial society, and therefore having a knowledge of, there's a lot of racial identities that you may need as a social worker and working with, particularly in some of our cities, to have a real understanding of actually what the sort of histories of those communities, which I think means you need to sit and talk to people, really, because you're not going to be able to carry as an individual all of that knowledge in your head. You're going to have to speak to people and understand their own history from their position. Yes. Do you want to come back, Remy?
Yes, just one thing, for me, it's really, I think there's a simple question that can be used, to start this, and Natalie alluded to it almost word for word earlier on, please tell me who you are. That's it. Please tell me who you are, and you don't have to rush. It's not like you have only 5 minutes, or you have 3 sentences in which to tell me who you are, because then, people sort of get, befuddled and confused, like, okay, what kind of question is that? Who am I? I'm supposed to say this in 3 sentences. No, you have time, take your time, but just tell me who you are. And as Natalie said, we go from there, and the answer to that question, well, you can build the whole of the rest of the relationship on the answer to that first question,
No, that's really helpful. And I have just realized, sorry, Natasha, you are back, and I didn't realize you were hidden off of my panel at the side. So
no, it's okay.
No, that's okay. I know you were talking about, I think you got cut off midway when you were talking about issues around whether it matters whether which parent is black. Do you want to talk about that, and then you can, if you want to raise anything about the use of terms such as half-caste or whatever terms social workers don't like using themselves, whichever that is.
I'm not sure where I sort of got to, but the gist of it basically was that I do very much believe that the predominant parent, or how that union is, in terms of what race or heritage the parent is, so mother or father, or who you live with as a significant caregiver or parent. I do definitely feel that has a huge factor in shaping your identity as an overall person. Definitely being mixed, and also as I think was mentioned as well, it's definitely interesting when you talk about it in terms of area. So a lot within Birmingham where I grew up, it's Birmingham where I grew up with my mum. And so I've always grown up in a really diverse society. My schools were diverse. I've always had a range of very mixed friendship group, and even the white people that were within my friendship group were very clued up. So their parents are sort of integrated, and we all live in the same community and know each other, and very culturally accepting everybody. That was very much my experience in that setting. However, it's my dad's side that live in Worcester, So it was a very different experience when I would go there and how I've grown up there. So I would often, I do remember, and I kind of laugh about it to my dad now, but I do remember often saying to my nan and granddad, who would take me out quite a bit, and my dad, and I would say, and I remember only being probably about 8 or something, and I just would notice that people would look a lot, or ask if I'm with them. If we were in the queue or something, they just assume that I'm not with them because I don't look anything like them. So it was just those small microaggressions that I'd pick up as a young child, really, and that forms part of my basis for making those changes and making people aware of those small, because people don't realize they're doing it. It's just natural to sort of assume those things. It's not an attack on those people that would say those things or assume that. We all sort of have preconceived ideologies about people and situations, so it's just to create awareness really about those things. And it is surprising how young children pick up on these things, and this is why it does need to be discussed, and bringing it back to where the information and research suggests that mixed race children get on better and develop a better sense of identity when in particular the white counterpart parent is open about these differences and things like that. With obviously support. It sounds like Dr. Remy had a mom that was kind of that way inclined, but yeah, it's just those things really.
No, that's really.
I'm not sure what the later question was. I sort of got the gist of the tail end of. I'm not sure if you could remind me of
right. No problem. So the question was about as social workers, when people we're working with ask us to use terminology that we ourselves aren't comfortable with. So for example, sort of half caste or mixed race or biracial or whatever it is, but the people who we are talking to use terms that we ourselves aren't comfortable with. How do we deal with that?
I feel it's panels like this and people like us that are generally interested in this topic and live the experience of it that can generate these conversations that can then lead us to these answers really. However, I do sort of maybe if there was upon these discussions, if there was maybe, which tends to happen in society really generally in terms of when government policies become influence change and stuff like that, in terms of things like terminology. So in reference to things like mental health, it's happened, race, gender, trans situations and topics. So I just suppose it's possibly people that are living that experience to come to a sort of consensus really, maybe, that is agreed in that realm or that setting almost.
Yeah, and I think that's similar to what Natalie was saying about just having that conversation really, and having that sort of talking about it and being prepared to talk about it. No, that's really helpful. Thank you.
I was just going to add as well, which I think is sort of important, is because it is obviously important as professionals when we're going in. I'm just talking in a social work context because that's what I'm doing, but it could be anything really if you're a teacher, nurse, or whatever the area that you work in. But I think it's sort of, we often suggest that you obviously you would say to the individual or the child and explain about yourself and your identity, but it's also not to make the mistake to assume that they're aware of their identity for them to tell you about themselves, because the whole point of my research and the whole point of the situation is, and why it's so it can be tricky, is because some of these mixed race people or children haven't had the chance to form their identity to even tell you what it is. They need help to sort of find out and explore what it is themselves. So it's sort of being aware of that as practitioners as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point. Actually, I'm gonna bounce that back actually to the rest of the panel, because I think what are other people's views on what do you do when you encounter people who who don't have that knowledge of, do you know what I mean, who don't have a firm understanding of their own racial identity. And there are a lot of people out there who, for whatever reason, have don't have a clear identity. And I know in Remy's book, you were, I think for me, some of those stood out, were some of those older people who for whom they'd had very difficult experiences around race, so they weren't certain at all. Do you want to start on that, Remy, and to say what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. The way I try to approach things, and perhaps this could also be, I use the word could also be useful in your work, is to try and see what is important to people, what is important to them. So when I say tell me your question, if in the answer to that there's nothing about the person's, the person doesn't actually talk about race, but actually maybe talks about, I don't know, their ideological preferences or some other areas and subject areas, that's a signal to me that, okay, perhaps actually race might not be that important to this person. There are people like that out there who really don't think about these things so much, and I encountered such people, during my interviews, and some of them, I wasn't able to use any material from the interview with them because simply, at least as far as, and I believe they were speaking to me sincerely, they really hadn't thought about this for most of their lives. They simply, people get on with life. They have all sorts of interests, passions, they fall in love, they look for jobs, they worry about money, etc., etc. And there's some people who don't really give this, deep thought or much thought, One while, I think somebody asked them something or pointed something out to them, but there were people who didn't, who like you say, don't really seem to give much thought to this, and that should also be respected. So then I'd focus on the things which they seem to talk about most and which seem important to them. So that's one. Then there's the other issue. It's another group you are talking about who perhaps are not sure, because of the fact that they've been told this by that group. I was told I am this person by this group. That person told me that, no, I'm actually not this person. I'm actually somebody else, and with those kind of people, I think the kind of approach I would think one could take is, one, to let them know, look, there is no expiry date to deciding your identity.
Yeah.
So there is no deadline by which you must have done this. Yeah. It's not an exam. Okay. Yeah. So take your time. And there are a lot of people, especially in their teenage years, who can really get anxious about this and say, oh, but, I can't seem to decide who I am yet, And what I say is, take your time. Like I say, it's not an exam. There's no deadline. Yeah. It can happen at 20. It can happen at 25. It can happen at 40, as long as you're able to live your life, as happily as possible, relatively till then, that's fine. This is not something you should feel a pressure that you have, because this is one of the also problems of the mixed race experience, that people feel a pressure that I have to declare, almost as if you are declaring for a tribe or you are declaring for a football club. I have to decide whether I'm a Liverpool fan or I'm a Man U fan. No, when it comes to you don't have to, and you definitely don't have to decide today. So that's one thing I think can be encouraging to people, if they, if we let them know that, look, don't feel any pressure, don't apply unnecessary pressure on yourself. There's already enough pressures in life, we have in life, work, job, money, bills, mortgage, etc., that people are thinking of. Don't add any pressure on your life that's not necessary.
No, that's I think that's really valuable, actually, and I think we do forget that there are people walking around for whom they don't think about race all the time, and particularly in a culture where actually we have got this current backdrop where there's just discussion about race in the media, on social media, it's just there, and it's an ever-present pressure. But actually, for some people, they walk through their lives and they really don't think about their skin color all of the time. And I think perhaps social work is sort of at risk sometimes of deciding that actually race is a really important thing and it's something we must do and we must demonstrate that we're dealing with, when actually we may be working with people for whom they just don't feel like that about race. And actually there should be the permission, if people say, actually this is not a big thing, for it not to be a big thing for them. So I think that's a really good point, and I do like the idea that there isn't a deadline on deciding. It is very true. It is very true. Natalie, did you have anything you wanted to say on that? No, that's okay. No, that's great. So then I was just going to come to a question from Dwayne. And he was directing his question to Natasha. But again, I think there's probably, probably all three panelists would have a view on it. And he says, as someone entering the social work sector, what more can social workers do to support families that struggling supporting or empowering children and their identities? So do you want, given the question was targeted at you, Natasha, do you want to start?
Yeah. It's still, I still just want to add, it would be everybody that is mixed will have a different mixed experience. So it's sort of just to add that it won't be a, you know, a one size fits all type of fix. It's literally for you to go in as the professional, decipher the situation based on your findings and speaking to that person. And then you can then take your casework and solutions from there. But I do think just in terms of basic suggestions would be to sort of, you know, if the predominant person is, which I'm assuming it would be based on the question, if the predominant person is the white counterpart and they're sort of struggling with how they can support this person, it's just things like maybe having some involvement with the Black community and being integrated in that way to be able to support the young person. General information about their heritage on the other side that they probably are not aware of based on the missing parent or parent that might not be around so frequently, or family that's not around. So it's just so they can get a sense of where they're from. I think I've had the sort of luxury of the opportunity to be so grounded in myself, because like I say, my mom was born in Jamaica and I lived with her, so she was able to tell me, and I could, you know, I was very much around for her lived experience because I live with her. I'm there, I see how she lives, I see people's response to certain situations. But then I also live in England and the UK where I'm experiencing the other side of things. So I had the luxury almost, or not the luxury, to sort of be clued up on both worlds. So I'm able to have a connection and a tie to Jamaica because of my mum, and that's why I feel grounded in that sense. Whereas somebody that sort of might be half African or half Jamaica but doesn't know their missing parent that is the Black person in that relationship, and they've been brought up with the white counterpart, I would very much assume and can see how you would feel a bit lost because you don't have a tie to that other part of you, and you don't really know much about it, or in terms of food, music, culture, just the culture in general. And that is the whole purpose of what makes you whole as your identity. So that missing will obviously have a void in some way.
Yeah, again, yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think, again, I mean, Remy, you might want to come in on this as well, but actually I think in your book you said around that you found that people that you said that having that family and having that sort of that structure around not seeing race entirely in itself. And I think some of the saddest stories there were those people who hadn't had that love around them. They hadn't had that's really where you saw racial identities breaking down. And I think that's important for social work to understand that actually in the context of a secure family, actually racial identity becomes less significant regardless of what it is. Do you want to come back in on that? Or
I think so. I mean, I'd go again to love. Clearly, for me, people who had grown up in homes, and of course, best case scenario, both parents, but if not one parent, as long as there was unconditional love felt by the child from that parent, the first person we seek acceptance from, the first person we want to accept into their tribe is actually our parents, and once a child feels that, and like I said, unconditional, not or if you do well in school, or if you do this, or if you behave yourself, then I'll love you, because children sense these things. But once the child feels that the love is unconditional, it gives a strength, it gives an inner strength, which makes it easier to deal with all the problems of the world, including racial problems, which are just, one of a wide range of problems which we all, or issues which we all face in life. So once that is there, it gives the child, an inner strength. So this is something which I think cannot be overemphasized to parents, how important it is really when you're bringing up little adults, because those are little adults, when you're bringing them up, love, love, love. This is what is going to make your child stronger in the future. This is what's going to make your child a stronger adult. And the less love you give, the less strong you can expect your child to be as an adult. Perhaps if it's put it that way, it might serve as some kind of motivational, as some kind of motivation. So I think this is really key. Regarding what Natasha spoke about, this is difficult, really. Like she says, if, for instance, you're the child of Black and white parents, and say you're being brought up by a white parent, the Black parent, for instance, is not in the picture, and then you're sort of wondering, there's nobody to teach you about Black history, or where do some of the problems between Black and white people stem from. That's a tricky one, I think. And I think the best thing, so I remember someone I spoke to, and she has a chapter there, Blazy. She was brought up by by a Black mom from Guyana. Her father was Irish, and he generally wasn't in the picture. But she says, one, I think her mom actually was also a social worker, nota bene, and so had a group of friends around her who helped with raising Blazy and showed her a lot of love. So she says, with my mom and with the friends she had around me, around us, showing me that love, she said, really authentically, I didn't really miss that much not having a father. That he wasn't in the picture. And so that was key, which I found amazing. She says her mom from Guyana taught her about Irish culture, taught her about, I think she said, Van Morrison and some of the famous Irish writers, and talked to her about Irish culture. So while on the one hand she talked to her about Black culture, she talked to her about Guyana, she talked to her about some the history, Black history, taught her Black history, etc. She also taught her Irish culture, which I found completely amazing. And to give her that sense that yes, I'm your mom, I'm Guyana, but there's your dad, so there's Irish culture. Embrace that. Feel a part of that. We don't have to just say because your dad is not here or you only see him once in a while that that we sort of cut off and pretend there's no Irish link here. No, embrace that. And she says that really helped her. And she says now she appreciates it so much. She says, I think my mom was amazing for a woman from Guyana to be teaching me about Irish culture, because obviously my mom had to first learn about Irish culture before then teaching it to her. So so that was a huge sort of that's the kind of sort of proactive kind of approach which any parent, I think any child would hugely appreciate coming from any parent. So this too, this is something that can be done too.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, absolutely. Natalie, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so I mean, before I went into social work, I was in education. I'd also been within the youth service in Derby. So I already had quite a lot of links within different areas. But going into social work and working with families around ethnicity and everything, for me, it was about knowing about the services, what were available for if I did need some more advice or something for the families. So it was about making links within the community as a social worker going into practice, about knowing what was on offer. I mean, now in most cities there is already like communities set up, so like within Derby there's community set up for every different like ethnicity, I would say. So that was really helpful. So I made contact with those and I had links in order to work with those families if I did need that support. Now I think what was really important for me in my practice is working with the parents, because educating them. So as Natasha spoke about, having a mom who knew a lot and could answer questions is really important, where sometimes we might have a family where mom is white British and doesn't really know much about, let's just say if dad is Black Caribbean, know much about like the community, the culture, care, skincare and things like this. And it's working with the mom, getting people involved, getting other agencies involved, making links with those communities, doing that one-to-one work with the mom, because sometimes people might see it as ignorance and that the parent doesn't want to do this, but it might not be that they know. So it's about working with them, educating the parents as well, if they want to. It's if they want to and if they want to engage in that. But also, I really think it's important with schools as well, working closely with the schools and other services what are involved with that family. And if we are looking around identity, supporting a child's identity, and the family supportive of this, working with the schools, putting something in place around, like we said, dual heritage. I mean, at the school I worked, there was 38 different spoken languages within this one school, and it was a very diverse school, and we had lots of different celebrations happening throughout the year. But something which I really took on board was celebrating like the Roma community. It was something which just in Derby, and we had like a new communities team what started, and it was really important then because there was some families then which were then starting to form relationships with white British people or people of Black Caribbean. So it was dual heritage families, and it was understanding the difference of different people's ethnicities, cultures, heritages, and working together. So I think it's really important about working with services.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely. I think I think it's like you say, it's around thinking about what people's experiences are, aren't they, and engaging with them and engaging with the communities that they live in. Remy, did you want to come back?
Yeah, just last thing, and I think which also could be very helpful, if parents are encouraged to encourage their children to ask them whatever questions are bugging them, and tell them, tell me what's on your mind. If there's something, weighing you down, if there's something you're feeling sad about, if there's something you're worried about, come to me. I know life, is difficult, people work, etc. Obviously, we know people have these problems, but, for parents who do want to put an effort in, it's important if the child knows, because many times mixed race children grow up not asking certain questions because, mommy or daddy have never really said, I can come to them with such questions. So maybe it's better not to bother them. They're busy working all the time, tired, etc. And they keep it to themselves, and then they mull it in their heads, and it worries them and worries them and worries them and worries them till they become adults and they still haven't resolved those issues, So it's important for the parent to give a signal, to send a strong signal that if there's something weighing you down, you're sad, please come to me, ask me about it, we'll talk about it. I'll help you as best I can. If I can't help you, I'll think about who else might be able to help you and give us some advice here. So it's important for the child to know that.
No, that's really helpful. Natalie.
Yeah, I just want to come back to, and I think it's really important for us as practitioners to understand that dual heritage, mixed race, is not just about black and white. It's not just about black and white. There's families, there's children of people made up of different ethnicities. It's not just whether someone is black and white. And I think that's really important, because I think sometimes people make assumption of someone just being dual heritage because it's a black and white, where it's not.
Yeah. No, and I think that's one of the conversations we've had a lot, isn't it? Is about whether people, the tendency to think about racial issues in terms of black and white. And I think that was, interestingly, came out quite well. I don't know whether people followed what happened yesterday on Politics Live, where the BBC got themselves into a little bit of hot water for asking, should Jews be considered an ethnic minority? And I think social work is in danger of doing exactly the same thing, of getting itself so caught up that it forgets that actually that ethnic minorities are, in its desire to be seen as very aware, actually only looks through the lens of the United Kingdom and through in a sense, actually looks through our colonial history and thinks of us being white colonizers against sort of Black African or African Caribbean communities, when actually there are a lot, and now that situation has moved on, and we now have people who actually have Black heritage, but actually still will appear white. And I have know people myself who have a Black parent, particularly who are mixed race parents, but their own child appears white, and then they're sort of edited out of that narrative because they don't look Black. So yeah, did Natasha, now I confess I cannot remember whether you started this conversation, so if you want to come in on it, please do.
Okay.
Yeah.
What we were sort of just alluding to. No, all I was going to add, actually, it was sort of it's obviously all relevant because it's all to do with the same thing, but it's kind of when Remy said there's no time frame to sort of figure all of this out, which is so true. And also it was just to add that it can also change. which is interesting because, like I say, I've sort of grown up with my identity, which I thought was, you know, pretty secure and stuff like that. And then a situation that kind of made me really begin to question things and think about things, and that was quite recent. So, and I'm 33 now, so for it to be so much later in life, after I thought everything was so secure and everything, was quite interesting, because I did a Miss Jamaica UK pageant, and I was one of the winners, and there was a little bit of uproar in a sense, because even though it's sort of known, or if it isn't known, Jamaica is quite mixed. So you get Chinese people that live there, you get Indian people that live there. It's not like a complete black population as people would assume. So to me, who is aware of these aspects, I wouldn't think it would be an issue for a mixed race person to say, oh, represent Jamaica. But it was interesting, the discourse around that, because of my heritage and because I was mixed. It was like, oh, you're not considered a whole person to be considered as to be able to represent Jamaica. So that was quite interesting. But I did have a conversation with somebody else who was sort of saying it is environment and places, as Remy and Natalie have also suggested, that create those different spaces and those discourses and ideologies around these issues. Because a friend was sort of talking, she did a similar dissertation actually, and she was saying that if you were a mixed race person in Jamaica, you probably would have you might have a slightly different experience almost. So yeah, that was just an interesting experience to say, and just to suggest that it does change. So that created a lot of questions for me, because I've always sort of thought, I'm very much close to the Black community. So when I suddenly felt that certain people had these feelings, it made me question myself, when I've always been amongst that community. So it's interesting how it can, sort of change along the way or shape you.
Yeah, I think that's something we don't talk about a lot, actually, isn't it? And that is the racism that mixed race people sometimes experience from Black people to mixed race people, based on skin tone, and in this case, sort of light skin colour. Yeah, that sort of issues of colour. Yeah. Which is I think, yeah, again, is I think something for social work to identify and to remember that actually it's quite possible that for mixed race people, that assuming that they will be at home, for want of a better word, really, in a Black community may deny some of their actual experiences of Black. Of being in the Black community. Again, something I think that was drawn out in some of the interviews that Remy did in your book, which I think is interesting. Moving on, we've got, I'll ask one more question. We'll do one more question and then we'll start to tie up. So I think this is just to move the conversation on a little bit away just from race. This is an anonymous person has talked about, I'll just ask the question, actually, it's not a long one. So when you speak of dual heritage or multi-heritage, can it only be applied to bloodlines or genetics, or can it be also applied to culture? For example, what if you were, let's say, Filipino, but you grew up in America and lived in America your whole life? So I think it's that discussion about the relationship between race and culture, and it's something that, Natalie, you alluded to in your sort of opening discussion, is that about being sort of race being, or racial appearance being the gateway to some sort of cultural experiences. And I think to a degree that everyone sort of talked about that. Do you want to start with that, Natalie? Is that a question you could pick up on?
Yeah, I mean, it is. So for me, it was around my skin colour was, like you said, my gateway into my ethnicity, really. So, I mean, it was really difficult for me as a child because my parents weren't brought up in their communities, because they formed their relationships out of the community. So, like I said, as a primary school child, it was normal. I didn't see any difference. It was when I went to secondary school that my identity and wanting to know more, that was when I questioned it more, and the cultural and around culture. And because I've seen in one of the questions, somebody made a comment about any like racism I'd experienced. I did experience it, because I had comments made to me that if somebody made a comment once about if there would have been arranged marriage, it would have been married, and I wouldn't have been my parents' problems no more. And this is like family members as well, and people would make these comments. And it was the cultural norms within my family network was very different. So like we said, my mum was Catholic, very strict Catholics. They went to a Catholic church. They were brought up, and then met my dad, who was Indian Sikh, but hadn't been brought up within the religion as a Sikh person. And they both had different cultural norms. But for us, my parents didn't bring us up with any, if that makes sense, because they didn't feel a part of their community still. But for myself and for my daughter, our cultural norms will be very different to other people's. So like we do practice, well, we do all three. We follow like some of the, like I said, the Indian Sikh culture norms and beliefs. Then we've got very Catholic, and then we've also Ukrainian. I mean, what our culture is very different now. We celebrate things could be very different as well within three different cultures. So to me, it's a really, I think that's a really hard question, and it's just what people understand and accept of what culture is and what's normal to them. To me, my culture is something so important for me. It's my identity as well. It makes me feel a part of something. It makes me feel a part of like a community. So when I go to the Ukrainian community, I'm a part of that. Our cultural norms bring us together. When I go to different like families, my cultural norms bring me part together, and that makes me feel nice. That makes me feel good. However, I know that some of those cultural norms and beliefs aren't always accepted by other people, and that has caused in the past too, like I said, we have experienced racism as a family, from my daughter to myself to my grandparents as well. And it's something like what Natasha said earlier about when she was in the queue with her grandparents shopping, like thought, was she with you? My dad got stopped a number of times with me because they didn't believe he was that was my father. And so there's so many difficult, along the way, there's been so many difficult experiences which we've had as a family, and we still continue to go on through it now. But I practice all of the cultural norms. I try and bring as much as I can into my family home, and also my extended family as well. So it's quite a difficult question, because I think culture is such an important thing. And I think sometimes understanding someone's culture is so important as well. Because when you have a good understanding, you will understand why that person identifies like that and is a part of that community, because I believe that's what forms part of my community and my identity.
Sorry, that's really interesting. Thank you, Natalie. Remy, did you want to come in on that point? On the issue of culture as well?
Would I be right in interpreting that what the person was asking is, should we only assume cultural differences where we see racial differences? Yes, or should we also be ready for cultural differences even where we don't see racial differences? So yes, the person said, for instance, there can be a Filipino person of Filipino heritage but raised in America, and so we shouldn't expect that person will exhibit Filipino cultural traits, so to be an American, so to say. Yes, I think, the answer to that would be yes. So very often, we assume, and often rightly so, cultural differences where we see racial differences. So we see a black person and a white person, and we assume, there's probably some cultural differences between them. But if we see, for instance, two black people, we think, they're probably culturally similar because they're both black. Or they're both white, they're both culturally similar. That's obviously not the case. So even, for instance, within Nigeria, there are vast cultural differences between people from various regions of the country. Even more so, there are differences between an average, as well, we're talking, of course, in general terms. There are differences between the average Nigerian and the average South African. There are significant, average Black South African, I mean, there are significant cultural differences here. And so we can't come into a setting and say, oh, he's from South Africa, she's from Nigeria. They're both Africans, so they probably have similar cultures. No, that's not the way it works. We definitely have to know that there could be significant cultural differences here. And I think what's important for us to try and find out, if they are, where the person was raised. So there's that example of a Filipino person raised in America. So if the person was raised in America, we can try and find out, how much American culture seems to have influenced this person's way of thinking. What do they think? Do they think, they quote unquote think like an American basically, or perhaps not, so we can tease that out, or try and tease that out, by finding out where people were raised, and definitely not make the assumption, the wrong assumption that, people of the same skin color are essentially culturally similar. Even if we're talking here in Europe, for instance, the Russian, there are significant cultural differences between, the Russian and the Swede, even though they're both white. So that's something I definitely want to say, and it's a common mistake I think we all make, assuming that racial similarity means cultural similarity. That's not the way it really works.
I think that's a really important point to make across any culture, really, that actually race is only it is an element of somebody's identity, but actually there is massive racial differences between different things. There was a point in one of the things you actually said, which I think really resonated with me, was that actually the concept of sort of black and white, actually that slavery was was what actually created this dynamic, because actually before slavery, African people wouldn't have seen each other as black. They would have seen each other in very tribal terms in terms of the differences between those different people. And I think that is, again, perhaps an aspect of the debate around the history, that we forget that actually our history created the discussion that we're having today, and that there is this distinction, that the distinction is between black and white, and not actually a distinction within people who appear the same. So that yeah.
Up till today, sorry, if you go to a random African city or town and pick a random person and ask them, who are you, they're not going to respond and say, oh, I'm a black person. They're going to respond and say, my name is this, I come from such and such ethnic group, I come from such and such region of the country, I speak such and such language. Those are the terms in which people, because like I said, in Africa, blackness doesn't mean anything because everybody's black. So what means something are the ethnic differences, cultural differences between people. It's over here, in the white majority world, that there's such a thing as blackness, that we say, oh, this person is black. Nobody thinks of themselves in those terms in Africa.
Yeah. And I think it is really important when you're working with people, particularly people who come from like Africa, or if we're working with people who have emigrated, here from different countries. Natasha, did you want to have the final word on that point?
Okay. Yeah, I think this has been one of the most tricky questions, but yeah, I'll sort of interject. But yeah, on the tail end of kind of what Remy just said about that side, it's quite similar in that context in Jamaica as well. I've only been a couple of times myself, but for quite long periods. But it very much is that sense of like, it's not the breakdown of the there obviously is colorism and those type of issues that exist and things, but it's a thing where you're Jamaican as opposed to breaking it down into labeling and as such. So it's like you're just a collective Jamaican, and that's how you're seen, type of thing. So it is when you're here, as was said, that there tends to be all these other confusing ideologies that complicate things further. And then yeah, I just wanted to add as well, based on what the question was, just a kind of a scenario. It is interesting with the whole the colorism aspect and sort of assuming things based on complexion and things like that, because although I will talk about my mixed race experience, as that's my biological makeup and that's been my lived experience. I have friends that are they're Black in terms of what their parents are, and complexion wise, they'll be it differs obviously, but some might be quite dark as well, but they've just had a light complexion. And so they obviously would identify as Black. However, because they'll be light, some of them are quite light in complexion, even as fair as myself, even though they're full Black. So in a roundabout way, they've almost had a mixed race experience because of how they are perceived by other people, although they identify as full Black. So that's quite interesting. So those friends that I speak to can almost identify with me being a mixed race person because of how they're perceived and treated by other people in their communities and things like that.
Yeah.
So it is very interesting.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's interesting. I have a friend who is one of a large family. I think he's got 6 or 7 siblings, and he's got one sibling who's very light-skinned and gets a lot of grief within the family, within his own family, based on it. And whilst I think a lot of it is probably fair to say it's sort of jokey, I think there are times when his brother feels that jokey gets a little bit close to the bone, and wonders whether sometimes that there is belief in it. And yeah, I think it's quite tricky. So it's an interesting point. We are at 2 o'clock, so I'm going to bring it to an end. If anybody wants, are there any closing points that anyone wants to make? I don't want to if anyone's got any burning points they want to make, there's a few minutes. No, that's great. So yeah, thank you for everyone for coming. We will, as I said, it has been recorded, and in time it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. This is one of a series of lecture. The next series of lecture will begin in mid-April and will be a series around domestic violence, and we'll look initially at the first lecture webinar will look at perpetrator programs. We'll then look at coercive control, and then the final one will look at mothering, domestic violence and social work interventions. So at the moment we don't have a platform to advertise them other than Eventbrite and our YouTube and our Twitter feed, which is at Wolverhampton Social Work. So I will try and disseminate all the information for those events in the way I have done this time. But if you are interested in any of those events, then you can follow us, as I say, on Twitter at WLV Social Work, and I will post them all there, and on Eventbrite, where they definitely will be as well. So thank you very much for attending, everyone, and thank you so much to our 3 panelists, to Dr. Remy Adekoya, and Natalie Sandar and Natasha Ashman, who came in fairly late. So thank you very much, Natasha. You had less time than anyone else to prepare. So thank you very much. I think it has been a really informative webinar, and I hope that everyone takes these conversations back to their workplaces and carries on having these conversations, because I think that's really how we develop our knowledge around these things, is to have the conversations, to have some brave conversations around race, and to talk in some, and to accept that we might not always get it right, but we can do our best to just keep the conversation alive. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.